Okay, so welcome back to part two of Reconstruction. This one is Reconstruction in the South. So you'll see how the actions of Congress played out in the South and what that meant for Southern people, specifically Black Southern people. So initially, it was bad, but then when Congress took over and they did the Reconstruction Acts, the Army protected the right of Black people to vote. And so what we're going to see is that we're going to get these Reconstruction governments that existed in when Black people served in office at the federal level and at the state level and at the local level. So this lasted for 1 year in Tennessee, but then up to 9 years in Florida. It just varied from place to place. White Republicans controlled state governments in every state but South Carolina. In South Carolina, freedmen controlled the lower house. So they had the majority. You can imagine that uh, Calhoun was just rolling in his grave, right? John C. Calhoun. All right, so these people, these Republicans, were referred to derogatorily as scalawags and carpetbaggers. So Southern whites who wanted to aid in the Republican cause, they were called scalawags, and oftentimes they were subject to the same intimidation and violence as Black people in the South. A lot of these people were former Whigs. They were interested in economic development and peace with the Union. So they wanted the South to develop an industry there instead of being agrarian. They also supported the effort to free the slaves after Reconstruction. And as I told you, they too suffered from a lot of the violence of white racists in the South. 30% of all lynchings in the South were on white people. So it wasn't just Black people. There were also carpetbaggers. This too was a derogatory term, as I told you in part one. Some people did come down and they were seeking economic gain, but for the most part, these people who came from the North, who were called carpetbaggers, they were humanitarians, philanthropists. They really, their hearts were in it. They really wanted to help freed slaves as ministers, teachers, medical professionals at the time. That was. All of these people, they wanted to lend them a hand, give them food, that sort of thing. So remember scalawags and carpetbaggers. So this is a cartoon right here, and you can see Thomas Nast's signature of it, of a carpetbagger, kind of the depiction of what the South saw in people coming down from the North, right? So it's a term that people who were unwelcome, they were strangers, they would come with all of their possessions, everything they could carry was in one bag, right? So they're seen as interlopers and people who exploit the wishes of the inhabitants. So that's how they were seen. So this is a Thomas Nast cartoon here. We'll talk more about it in class. But what we're going to see during the Reconstruction Acts is that Black people were elected to political office, and most of those people were educated. Many of them had property. They were upstanding members of their community, ministers, teachers, businessmen. Hiram Revels, the man seated here to the left, he was born in North Carolina, free, but then he moved on to Ohio, and what he did, he was a strong supporter, as you can imagine, for the Union cause. He aided in organizing a Black regiment, and then during the war, he worked with them as their minister. He is the first Black man to be seated in Congress, and he was appointed there. So unfortunately, he wasn't elected, so his term was short. But he was appointed to take the seat that Jefferson Davis previously had. Actually, there's somebody, I think, in between the two of them. But it's the same seat. There's also a man by the name of Blanche Bruce who was born a slave in Virginia, and he was elected to the Mississippi Senate, and he served from 1875 to 1881. So he did an entire term of office in the Senate because he was elected. But unfortunately, Hiram Revels did not. Over a dozen Black Republicans were elected to the House, and what this did is this really created a lot of anger among whites in the South. And if you look at it, this is how they were able to get elected. I mean, some Confederates couldn't vote. The rights of black people were protected. And in some states, well, South Carolina and Mississippi, blacks outnumbered white people. You can see in Louisiana, the numbers are pretty high, as in Georgia. Probably when you get up into Virginia and then North Carolina, that's where their numbers were lower. All right, and you can see here, if you look at Louisiana, it's almost 50-50, 50%. South Carolina, there are more black voters than there are white voters. Most of those people who are black who could vote, the core of them were veterans, but black people, they were unprepared. They didn't know the system, right? They'd been slaves all their life. They didn't know how to read and write, so they really didn't know what to do. But they could start to register under the protection of the Union Army as early as 1867. And as I said, they're most numerous in Louisiana and South Carolina. All right, so normally Thomas Nast used his cartoons to elevate the status of black people, but this one, this was on the cover of Harper's Weekly. Let's see, when was this? I'm not sure. I think that it was in 67, which portrays black people as just buffoons, right? Who are, I don't know, stereotyped as idiots, loud, obnoxious, ill-behaved, those sorts of things. And that's probably more the Southern attitude. Oftentimes, he did that for Irish people too. He made Irish people almost look like monsters. Thomas Nast was from Germany, so maybe he thought he was better than those Irish people. I don't know. But anyway, during Reconstruction, there were about 2,000 African Americans who did hold public office. Most of those were in state legislatures. And 600 in the state legislature. You have people in the House of Representatives. You have 2 in the Senate, and then local political offices as well. They also served as the delegates when writing these new state constitutions. They were encouraged to do so by the Union League, which was this organization or organizations, different branches of it, that formed during the Civil War to aid in the Union cause. Now they go down there, and these are some of those carpetbaggers who want to help in that cause. So they form a coalition, black voters do, with scalawags and carpetbaggers to try to get black people elected to Congress. And this made up the black people made up the majority of the Republicans in the South, because almost everybody in the South who was white was a Democrat. And if you weren't, you were going to be intimidated. All right, here's another Thomas Nast cartoon. If you can look on the left, there's a grave, and Columbia is sprinkling all those bad things in there, like slavery and amnesty and everything else, into a grave and burying it. But now we're at this tender point where it looks as if the Democrats could dig all that stuff back up, right? So anyway, if we look at the Republican Reconstruction here, they did achieve some of their goals, and it was good. We are going to get universal black male suffrage, property rights for women, debt relief, and a modern penal code, right? But and they also established some institutions there. We're going to get schools, aid to the disabled, hospitals, all sorts of things. And as far as the schools go, that benefited not just black people, but also white people, because remember, the South didn't have public education. The only state that really did was Massachusetts. Some others were kind of getting on board, but it was slow, and that was from the reform movement, right? It also started to provide funding for the South and aiding them through taxation and selling bonds. Another Thomas Nast cartoon, by the way. All right, and then this cartoon here, this is James Wales. He did this cartoon because, and this is more the Southern idea of Northern Reconstruction, right? The South depicted the Republicans as corrupt and wasteful. And that's kind of what this cartoon says. If you look on the left, you see Lady Liberty or Columbia, and she's burdened by this heavy carpet bag and all this military equipment. And I'm pretty sure that the man sitting in that carpet bag is Grant. And also, Grant is propped up by Union Army, and poor Columbia is walking on this bed of rocks with poor feet, or bare feet, poor soul, right? And in the background, you can see that the South is just in ruins. roads, everything's burnt, you know, the sinking ships, all sorts of things. And then you have over here somebody who looks like maybe Jefferson Davis. And there's all sorts of different things that are going on, and we'll talk about this in class because there's a lot of symbolism to it. But now on the other side, you know, the one on the left is supposed to be the strong government, and the one on the right is supposed to be the weak government, right? But then the weak government is tilling the soil, and in the background you can see there's all business and things are taking place. So we'll talk about this in class, and this was the southern view of Reconstruction. So African Americans and how they adjust, and this is the last section that we're going to be discussing, and a lot of it are cartoons or photographs. All right, so what Black people wanted to do is they wanted to build their own communities, right? So a lot of people, they want to learn how to read and write, so they start these schools for Black people throughout the South. They also build Black churches, and Black churches are going to be very, very important down in the South, and I think in many communities they still are. Some people have kind of gotten away from the church, but it's still kind of the center of many Black communities in the South. A lot of independent Black schools were created and paid for by and educated by Black people. And then we're going to get some Black colleges and institutions, and you can see on this map over here where those colleges and institutions are, and we'll look at this more in class. Also, and I've talked about this, we're going to get Fisk, Howard, Morehouse, Atlanta University, and other colleges specifically for Black people. Some Black people were able to leave, not very many, but some. And when they did, they went to Kansas. And you can see right here, here's a flyer, all colored people go to Kansas on September 5th, 1877. Can do so for $5, so that's going to help to pay their way. And here are some exodusters, and that's what they were called. And these people are on the levee at St. Louis. I don't think it's East St. Louis. Looking at the river, maybe waiting for a train to get to Kansas. I'm not sure. I do love this this picture though. Little Miss Sassy Pants. There's a little girl to the left, and I always laugh at this picture. She's got her arms crossed and she's giving a dirty look. Maybe she didn't want her picture taken, but I always think it's cute. What we're going to get is for Black people, it's very, very difficult to have access to land, right? And that's what they really needed. And that's why there was that call, 40 acres and a mule. For a lot of people and a lot of reformers, they thought Black people should be given land. There should be land redistribution after the Civil War. And as I told you, the Freedmen's Bureau did do that for a while, but then the courts intervened, and then they made it to where that land went back to the previous owner because of legal issues. But all that said, white ownership decreased in land and Black ownership did increase. And when I was living in Virginia, I remember driving around and you would see, you know, people, Black farmers on their tractors on their land. So in Virginia, some Black people and Black families did have land. And it continued on for a few generations. One thing we're going to talk about in class, watch a video, is sharecropping. So what happened after the war, landowners, they wanted to bind Black people, freed slaves, to the land so that they would have a steady workforce. And they wanted to keep them there for a set number of years, but Black people were like, no, I am free. I don't have to do this, right? So what they did is they came up with this sort of program where it's called sharecropping or tenant farmers. Now, if you're a tenant, then you're living on somebody else's land or in their property, their house, and you're paying them rent, right? And if you're sharecropping, then you are working the land and then you're going to get a share of the harvest, right? So to do this with Black people, they don't have anything. You know, they don't even own probably the clothes on their back. Some of them had some money, and some of them, though I should say, were able to make money even as slaves by selling, you know, goods or wares or something that they made in their own time. But anyway, so the landowner would say, hey, I will give you the seeds, I'll give you the plow, I'll give you the mule, I'll give you the equipment and the clothes and the place where you can stay, and you farm this land. You're going to work the land. Then at harvest, what's going to happen is then the tenant farmer is going to get a share of that, but then the property owner is going to say, now you have to pay me for the seed and the equipment and the house and all of these things and the donkey, all these things that you use. Well, maybe the harvest didn't make up for all the equipment and everything that he needed, so he's in debt. And then he's going to get the seed and everything else. Very few people ever got out of debt. Only about 5% of them actually got out of debt and even owned their own land. Now, the majority of sharecroppers were not black. They're actually white. But the white people kind of had an alternative. They were free to do other things. They didn't have to be bound as much to these contracts as the black people were. As a matter of fact, they were so bound to them that later when they wanted to flee and go north and get a factory job, they'd have to like sneak out of the South, cover of darkness. All right, so this is kind of how it works. So you'd get a merchant or the landowner that would furnish all of the tools and the seed up to 60%. They could charge up to 60% interest on that loan, which was astronomical, right? And then the farmer would secure clothing and all the other necessities that he would need from the merchant. The merchant would hold a lien or a mortgage on the future crop. So then the landowner, then to the right, he rents the land in exchange for a quarter to a half of the crop. So that crop, you're beholden to the landowner and the merchant, or just the landowner if the landowner is also the merchant, which sometimes could work. So then this poor tenant farmer, he works the crops, he harvests it in the autumn. Then he turns over half of the crop to the landowner as payment for rent, and then he gives the rest of it to the merchant for payment. And he's usually left with nothing of his own. And then he has to borrow again to get the seeds, to get the supplies, to do everything he needs to do for the following year. So it's just this endless cycle of being in debt. But white people then have that steady labor force. So it's a new form of slavery, essentially. Now, if you look in the Black Belt, and that is the area kind of where it says North Carolina, it kind of comes down to where it says Alabama. There's a high population of black people. That's the greatest concentration of sharecroppers, but they're all over the South, right, in various numbers. Right, if you look to on the left, this would look like a plantation after the Civil War. You would have the main house, and then around it, you would very close to it, you have slave quarters. After the Civil War, kind of the same place, you got the landowner's home, and then more scattered around would be the sharecroppers, and the sharecroppers would farm a little bit of field that was assigned to them. So the whites exercised control over these people in a similar manner that they did under slavery, right? Blacks really had no freedom to control their own lives, and whites exercised all sorts of control over them. Women resisted working in the fields. Children whose labor had been dictated by the owner under slavery now got to attend school, though. So that's one thing that changed. All right, so the North during Reconstruction. So we know what the South was like. Most black people were subjected to having to work as sharecroppers, tenant farmers. And you're going to see, too, they're also going to suffer from intimidation, violence, and everything else. So what's going on in the North is that all these industries are kicking out for the war effort, and what we're going to get is the second big industrial revolution that's going to take place. And this one's going to center on steel and the railroad, right? But politically, what happens is we get this period of political corruption, right? These party bosses, like this guy right here, he's doling out these jobs, right? One is like immunity from arrest or special privileges. So they control the police, they control city council, they control everything. They control who gets a job, who gets fired, right? If you're working for a municipal area, municipal meaning city, local government, or maybe they can get you a job with a local factory or something like that. So people in power, they manipulate the businesses, they manipulate governments in ways to where they know what's going on. So they're taking bribes, they're giving bribes, they're extorting money. They've got all these cronies that do their bidding. There's nepotism. You're going to hire your children, your brother, whomever, your Uncle George for all of these different jobs. Everybody's going to be beholden to you. You're going to be in power. You're going to control things, and you're going to use graft to get very rich. Graft is a way of knowing about what's going to happen so that you could benefit financially. So let's say you know that the city is going to go and buy a road and tear down these row houses, these dilapidated houses. Well, you go buy those houses for nothing, right? Because the city's going to come and do that, but the city wants them, and so they're going to pay high dollar to get them. Well, you bought them for nothing, and you're going to sell them for a lot because you knew what was going to happen. That's graft. It's kind of like insider trading. And so that's what all these politicians were doing, and no doubt they probably still do. Right? So the main party bosses, if you look right over here, is Roscoe Conkling on the top, and then James Blaine on the left. Now, these people controlled everything through political patronage, the spoils system. To the victor goes the spoils. So these two had a lot of power, and then they had their cronies, the people who kind of did their bidding. And if you get their support, then you might become president. But then again, they both wanted to be president too. So Roscoe Conkling, he was from New York City, and he was the leader of what's known as the stalwarts, those people who like that system of political patronage and the spoil system and don't want it to change. That's what a stalwart is. You're kind of resolute. But then you got James Blaine, who's part of the half-breeds, right? This is a name given to them because they're kind of like half Republican. They're only half Republican because they're not in for that. And one thing that they advocated, though, was for civil service reform, meaning that people got their jobs based on their qualifications after taking a test rather than just being appointed by some party boss. So that's what Blaine is going for. But Blaine, he was known kind of as the tattooed man because he had like the Erie Canal and other railroads and different businesses that had given him bribes. So he's kind of talking on both sides of his mouth. All right. And then what we're going to get, all this corruption. And one of the first ones is going to be Black Friday. And this is when two guys, financiers, railroad tycoons, they kind of cornered the market on gold. So the price of gold was low, and they bought a whole bunch of it. And by buying it, then it drives up the price, and then they're going to sell it for that higher price, right? So they do this, and they get Ulysses S. Grant, President Grant's brother-in-law, involved in it, who tried to convince the Treasury Secretary not to sell any gold. Well, what happens is the Treasury Secretary sells off $4 million of gold, and that stabilizes the market. So then it was all good, right? At that time. How that works, I don't know. But people found out about it, and they were horrified by it because it upset things. And Gold is going to be involved in other things as well. He's also involved with boss William Tweed of New York City, a big party boss in that city who's very corrupt. All right, there's also this scandal, Credit Mobile. I don't know how, it's kind of a French company, but it was also a sham company that was created as part of the Union Railroad, Union Pacific Railroad, the transcontinental railroad that was going to go from basically Chicago out to California via the Central Pacific, where they were going to meet up at Promontory, Utah. So they're building the transcontinental railroad. So the government subsidized this. By subsidizing it, meaning that they gave them land, and they were also going to give them money for every mile of railroad that was created. They also got like a whole bunch of land, strips of land on either side of the railroad. So they got this. So Credit Mobile was set up, and they're taking all this money from the government, and then they're turning around and they're giving stocks and benefits to people in government who knew that they were not a good company, but everybody's getting rich off of the taxpayers. So basically they're taking money from the taxpayers to this company that's not really doing anything except taking the money. right? And so people find out about that. The story was broke by the New York Sun, and people are all implicated in this, including James Blaine, right, and also the vice president under Grant, Colfax, right? And you can see up here, this is Credit Mobile, and everybody's taking a piece of the pie, and these are all the people who are getting in trouble. And that's Uncle Sam there, who's very angry with them for what they have done, and those are all the perpetrators of this scheme. Right, there's also the whiskey ring. So this was a scheme of a lot of government officials. I think like 100, yeah, 110 people were convicted of this, where liquor producers had to pay a fee to government officials in order to make liquor. It's an excise tax, right, on liquor. And so the money from that they were taking, they were giving it to the Grant reelection campaign. So it was all very, very corrupt. Apparently, Grant didn't even know that this was going on, but his own personal secretary was indicted, but then acquitted from it. But the Treasury Secretary had found out about it, and he investigated it. And in the end, like 110 people were convicted. So they're just taking money that's supposed to go to as revenue to the federal government, and all these people are paying it, and people are just lining their pocket with it. There's also the Indian ring. So this guy, Belknap, he kind of set it up. Well, his wife set it up to where there would be a license for this one company to trade on this newly built Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which was for the Indians. So they could trade there. And then what would happen is Belknap's wife was getting like a kickback, dividends, twice a year or quarterly, I think quarterly, of a lot of money. So Belknap was getting like $20,000 a year from this company, even though his salary was only $8,000 a year. And he knew what was going on, but it was reported, he was found out, and he goes to Grant, and he sobs, and he's sad, and he resigns. That didn't stop Congress. Congress wanted to impeach him anyway. So anyway, even though Grant was never directly involved in any of this, he kind of presided over this. He trusted people way too much. And so what the Democrats were doing is they were trying to use this as leverage against him, and they wanted to draw up articles of impeachment against Grant, even though, as I said, he didn't know what was going on at the time. Okay, and then there's this guy, Boss Tweed. He is probably one of the most corrupt city bosses that there was, especially at this time. He was very, very powerful. Initially, as a good guy, he wanted to help out, but then over time, he just wanted to have power and control. So he used this power to nominate people to different positions, and also to give out patronage jobs, different jobs to people in New York City. And he also controlled the judges. So that determined who did and who didn't get prosecuted for crimes. So because of the graft and the bribes and the corruption, he became very, very rich. And all those people involved in it were part of a ring of people who, extorted money, who took bribes, who, embezzled money from the taxpayers and that sort of thing. It is estimated that he defrauded the government of New York City by about $200 million. The person who exposed him were the cartoons of Thomas Nast, and then also reports by the New York Times. There was a prosecutor in New York by the name of Samuel Tilden who worked to have him convicted. So he was convicted of treason, which is surprising to me. But then he was put in jail, but then he escapes. He goes to Cuba and Spain. Later, he was extradited back to the United States. He's put back in prison where he died. All right, so these are some images by Thomas Nast of Boss Tweed and the Tweed ring. You can tell Tweed on the left there, he's the big fat guy, and in front of him on the floor it says Tammany Hall. So if you got all these people involved, you don't really know where the money is, and so it's a ring. Well, he did it. No, he did it. No, he did it. And he's just kind of pointing the finger at all these different people. On the right here, too, this is Boss Tweed, and he's right by the ballot, right? In counting, there is strength. And, Lenin said, it's not the people who count, it's the people who do the counting who count, right? So it was pretty obvious that the elections were very corrupt at this time. No comment on today. All right, so this right here, this is Thomas Nast. He is known as the father of the American cartoon. He's German born. I have that father of the political cartoon. I have it twice. And he's also known as the president maker because he became very, very powerful with his commentary and his cartoons. He worked for a long time with Harper's Weekly, but then he went off. He wanted to do something else when their popularity waned after the Civil War. And then he had some bad investments. And so he was going to be appointed by Teddy Roosevelt to be like a representative to Ecuador or something like that. And then he goes down to Ecuador and he gets yellow fever and he dies in 1902. But anyway, he was a strong advocate for the Union cause, and then also for Ulysses S. Grant. And he really liked Grant. And you've seen a lot of his political cartoons. But aside from that, he's credited with the modern version of Santa Claus, the Democratic donkey, the Republican elephant. Many credit him with making sure that Lincoln got reelected for his second term and for bringing to light the corruption under the Grant administration, even though I love Grant, and then also Boss Tweed. All right, so that brings us to the election of 1872. And in this election, Grant's up for re-election, and the Republicans do what they did in the previous election of 68 was wave the bloody shirt, you know, reminding people about the suffrage during the Civil War and that sort of thing. Of course, Grant's a hero, but then the liberals, liberal Republicans, right, the radical Republicans, they're calling for civil service reform. They want to end railroad subsidies. They don't want the government to subsidize railroads any longer because of credit mobile, right? And they also want to withdraw troops from the South. So this kind of split the Republicans, right? And they end up having two conventions. And Horace Greeley, this guy who he would have been considered woke, you know, nowadays. He just was into everything, you know, this and this and this. He's been vegetarian, right? So he's into all these different things, and some people play him as a kook, right? But they said, well, we need to get Greeley in there to run. He had been an editor for the New York Tribune, and he had exposed the corruption of the Grant administration. And so what he says is like, yeah, I want the same things those people want. So he's running, even though he's a Democrat, as a liberal Republican. So he's Democratic ticket and liberal Republican ticket, right? Greeley is portrayed as this crazy idiot, a fool, and then his wife is going to die just before the election, November of 1872. And then between the time of the election and the counting of the electoral votes, he dies. And then, so what does the elector do? What's the electoral college do? Where are their votes going to go? He's dead, right? So then we're going to have a lot of people who end up showing up as getting electoral votes for president. Right, this is a Thomas Nast cartoon, and what it's weird, I know, but the Democrats and the liberal Republicans are kind of swallowing each other. So Greeley kind of went along with this element of the Democrats, you know, which Nast shows as Tammany Hall, convicts, corruption, the KKK, all working with Greeley to get elected president against Trump. All right, so you can see here, look at all those names. You've got Grant, who won by an electoral landslide, right? And then you have other people too, people that I don't even know of. Greeley ended up getting, I can't read that, what is that, 45% of the popular vote, which is not a bad showing, right? But Grant won handily in the electoral vote. And then here you could see where the Grant's vote was the strongest in the lighter blue color, and then the purple color, that was Greeley. Okay, and then what we're going to have when Grant is in his second term, we're going to get what's known as the Panic of 1873. Now we would call it a depression. But what happened is that there was overproduction of industrial goods. There's over speculation as well in the stock market. And so what happens is that results in a lot of businesses failing. And when they fail, they lay people off. So there's really high unemployment rate, like 14%. There are foreclosures on farms and homes and businesses, banks close, people are in debt, so it's really, really bad. So there's the whole money question. Now, during the Civil War, the North printed greenbacks, and this was money that wasn't backed by gold or silver. And so people who owed money wanted to do that. If you drive the price of things up and you have more money in your hand, then you can pay off your loan easier, right? But the people who lent money to people wouldn't be getting back the same value if that were the case. So they wanted to go with gold or silver. And so they pushed the Specie Resumption Act of 1875, and Grant went along with it. And so from that time on, at least for a period, then the greenbacks, the money was supposed to be backed by gold or silver, meaning that you could go and turn it in and get the same value for your dollar. Now there's not enough gold on earth to make up for how much money is produced in our country. It's just the value that you place in that piece of paper. Okay, so I'm not sure if this is a NAS cartoon or not, but what it does, it kind of shows the greenback in the shadow of specie, the hard currency that the government demanded be produced. So there were $450 million worth of greenbacks that were issued during the war, but the money was backed only by the government, right? The debtors wanted this to continue, but people who lent money didn't because the value would be depreciated. So the U.S. resumes redemption of gold, the specie, as of January 1st, 1875, and then steps were made to reduce the greenbacks that were in circulation so that you just have specie out there. So all paper coins, all those greenbacks, anything less than $1 were replaced by silver. This was referred to as the crime of 1873, even though it was 1875. All right, so now let's look at the end of Reconstruction, what this means, how that happens, and what this means for people in the South. All right, so what happens is white people return to power, and they do that through violence and intimidation, right? So they get power, and then they intimidate, and they use this in violence through secret societies. They want to reclaim government so that they can reduce their taxes, reduce spending on social programs, and regain white supremacy. So they create these secret societies. The White League in Louisiana, this one was a group of former Confederate soldiers who kind of coalesced together, and this kind of came out of this Colfax massacre in Louisiana. What happened in Colfax, Louisiana, after a Republican was elected governor by a very, very close margin, and some people thought that it was rigged, then white people riot, and they kill about 150 black people. So this White League came out of Louisiana. Then in Tennessee, a group that started and spread throughout the South was the KKK. It emerged. And then in Mississippi, you had a group known as the Red Shirts. So this is a Thomas Nast cartoon to the left over here, and you can see the man on the left, he's got a rifle with a bayonet, right? They're the former Confederates, and they have, it says White League, right? He's got a hat there, and then on the right, you got a member of the KKK, and they're shaking hands. You know, they're partners in this. And then you have this poor black couple down below protecting their child, and in the background, somebody's being lynched, and school is being burnt. And then up above, it says the vision as it was. And it said, what does that say? Something like, this is a white something government there. So they're going to use this violence and intimidation to keep black people in subservient levels to whites in the South. Right, so this is the KKK. It was originally founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a former general in the Confederate Army, and it started out as just this sort of fraternal organization, but then it turned into like this paramilitary organization, and it became known as the Invisible Hand. As a matter of fact, Forrest tried to disband it, but it had already taken hold and it started to spread throughout the South. And what they did is they did night raids. They would go and intimidate people in their home, maybe beat them up by wearing these masks on. They might burn your home, burn your school, burn your church. You could lose your home, you could lose your property, you could lose your job, something like that. So there was a lot of intimidation to control the Black population in the South. So as a result of this, what happened during Grant's administration is Congress passes the Enforcement Acts in 1870 and 1871. They're also known as the Force Acts or the KKK Acts, right? The Ku Klux Klan Acts. And so what these were, they put the president could enforce martial law in the South to protect Black people, and in fact he did do that in South Carolina in 1871. But the main target was to prohibit white people from banding together to intimidate or commit acts of violence against Black people. So they made it illegal to band together or to go in disguise upon public highways or upon the premises of others. So you couldn't keep them from banding together in certain places, but you can't go on public highways. You can't use our roads to do this, and you can't do it on other people's property, right? It also prohibited states from discriminating against voters on the basis of their race, right? And the federal government would oversee the elections and prosecute offenders. So while the military was in charge down there, then the Klan was kind of submissive, right? But once the military leaves, then they're free to do what they want. All right, but then the North is tiring of all of this. And so what they do is they pass the Amnesty Act. People just want to get on with their lives, put the Civil War behind them, and they really don't know what's going on in the South, and they're not paying attention because there's so much going on in the North, as you're going to see in subsequent chapters. So they passed the Amnesty Act of 1872, and that removed all restrictions on ex-Confederates except for those that were in the top. And so now what happened is that Democrats were able to reclaim control of state governments. And you can see here with this NAS cartoon, the color line is broken, right? So Republicans go to vote, and the Republican voter is represented by this Black man. He's going to vote, and there's really nothing to vote for because you only have one vote. See, there's one voting box. Remember I told you there were two? And it says the Republican Party is dead. The South, solid democracy, right? Peace. And offerings and all of that. So now Democrats are going to take control of government, and the lives of Black people are going to be threatened. All right, then we get the presidential election of 1876. And the Republicans choose Rutherford B. Hayes. He had been a governor from Ohio, and he had no connections to the Grant administration, so he was free from any of that corruption that was going on. The Democrats choose Samuel Tilden of New York, a governor who made a name for himself when he prosecuted William Tweed, Boss Tweed, right? And so he's very popular, and he won by a pretty good margin in the popular vote. But then it came down to the electoral vote, and Tilden only needed one to take the majority and then become president. But there were still these outstanding popular votes from South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, all these states that had federal troops there because of the Enforcement Acts, right, and Reconstruction Acts. So Congress creates a commission, and Republicans have control of Congress. And so on a party vote of 8-7, they choose Hayes. Well, people are furious about this, at least Democrats were. So they negotiate this. So they have this commission. Hayes would get the remaining 20 electoral votes from Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, the ones under government control, if, and here are the conditions, and the book only listed 2, but there are actually 4. So troops would be pulled out of those states, Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, right? So federal troops would be out. Once federal troops were out, then Democratic leaders in the South were free to do what they wanted to do and return to the South to what it was. It would be redeemed, pretty much what it was before the Civil War, absent slavery. So the troops are going to pull out. There's going to be a construction of a transcontinental railroad from the south. Or Democrat is supposed to hold a cabinet position, and a guy by the name of Key from Tennessee was appointed as a postmaster. And then there would be legislation to encourage industrialization of the South. Yet another NAS cartoon right here. It's, you see one hand keeping the South from picking up the gun, blood for Tilden or Tilden for blood, right? So anyway, a truce, not a compromise, but a chance for high-tone men to retire gracefully from their very civil declaration of war. But what that's going to mean in the South is the birth of Jim Crow. So racial segregation will begin after Reconstruction. These Jim Crow laws that segregate black people and white people, and that was institutionalized by the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which ruled that separate but equal was constitutional. That was in 1896, and we'll talk more about that later. Also, in the South, the white Democratic-controlled government, they keep black people from voting by enforcing poll tax or literacy tests, intimidation, all sorts of things. Black people are tied to the land through black codes as well. And this isn't going to change until the Civil Rights Act of, well, there's going to be the Brown versus the Board of Education of 1954, Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Thank you. This ends chapter 15 and the last chapter for period 5. I will see you in period 6.